After growing up in Harlem, Thomas Sowell served in the United States Marine Corps, then received an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a master's degree from Columbia, a doctorate from the University of Chicago. After teaching at universities that included Cornell, Brandeis, and UCLA, Dr. Sowell became a fellow at the Hoover Institution in 1977. Thomas Sowell is the author of some 40 books, including his newest volume, Social Justice Fallacies. And this past spring, he turned 93. You take on various fallacies here. Let's take on a couple of them. The equal chances fallacy. Even in a society, I'm quoting you, social justice fallacies, even in a society with equal opportunity, people from different backgrounds do not necessarily even want to do the same things. In American sports, blacks are very overrepresented in professional basketball, whites in professional tennis, and Hispanics in Major League Baseball. Why is that telling?
Because the implicit assumption, and sometimes explicit assumption, is that in a world where everything was fair, where everyone was treated fairly, you would have, things would be representative of the population demographics as a whole in all these various activities.
Right.
Imagine a black kid born in Harlem, and he's born with a body identical to that of Rudolph Nureyev, the great ballet dancer. There's the odds are 1,000 to 1 that he'll become a ballet dancer, much less another Rudolph Nureyev. I mean, he would be looked at strangely by all his friends in the neighborhood if he even wanted to do that.
What you mean?
But chances are he wouldn't even think about it.
Right. So you mean to say that when you tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers, you tried out for the pitching position in the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they didn't hire you, you were not being discriminated against?
Actually, I was trying out for first base, and the real reason I messed up was that my position was center field. But in order to be a good center fielder, I need hours and hours of practice. And it was a very bad spring. I got very little practice, and so I figured at least I won't go out and make an idiot of myself in center field. So I made an idiot of myself at first base.
Right. Chess pieces fallacy. The chess pieces fallacy.
Yeah.
Explain that one.
Well, Adam Smith had a very low opinion of abstract theorists who imagine that they can control a whole society with the ease with which one puts chess pieces where you want them on a chessboard. And so there's this notion of this inert mass of people down there, and then the wonderfully brilliant people at the top who ought to be telling them what to do. And there's no thought that, first of all, those at the top don't even know the people's individual conditions, who are very different from themselves, and when they try to help, they can make things disastrous.
You discuss a theory of justice. This is under knowledge fallacies.
Yes.
A theory of justice, which is in certain circles. Every university in the country, the philosophy department, political science, you'll get it in sociology. This is the big book on social justice, written by John Rawls, philosopher at Harvard. I'm quoting you, Tom. Rawls refers to things that society should arrange. You quote him, arrange. That's the word he uses. And then Tom Sowell says, interior decorators arrange. Governments compel. It is not a subtle distinction. Explain that.
Well, if you're going to try to get some kind of result, you have to specify through what kinds of mechanism you expect to get that result. And different mechanisms, whether it's the government, the market, the Red Cross, whatever, they have their own individual things that they're good at and not so good at. And so you can't get the social justice result that you want unless you have the kind of institution that's likely to produce that result. Politics is not that kind of institution.
And yet they all implicitly rely on government.
Yes.
Redistribution of wealth, adjusting using legal regimes to adjust the proportions of various groups that get certain jobs. They all rely on government. And what's distinctive about government is it's the one institution that can send you to jail.
Yes.
All right. And that's the point is that's dangerous. We shouldn't want more government, more hands in the power of the politicians.
Yeah, one of the
real
real problems is that you have people making decisions for which they pay no price when they're wrong, no matter how high a price other people pay. And right now, the homicide rates are beyond anything that were around, let's say, prior to 1960. And I mentioned 1960 in this case because that's when the Supreme Court remade the criminal law. They discovered rights in the Constitution that no one had noticed for over a century. And they were impervious to evidence.
So contrast your neighborhood in Harlem when you were an 8 and 9 and 10-year-old boy with what we see in neighborhoods in Chicago today.
Oh my gosh. People are astonished when I tell them I grew up in Harlem. I can't remember ever hearing a gunshot. And then I've checked with my relatives who grew up in similar neighborhoods in Washington and down in North Carolina. They never heard a gunshot when they were growing up. I remember going back to Harlem some years ago to do some research at a high school. And I looked out the window and there was this park there near the high school. And I mentioned in passing that when I lived in Harlem as a kid, I would take my dog for a walk in that park, and looks of horror came over the students' faces. People have no idea how much has retrogressed over the years in the black community, and how much of what progress has been made has not been made by politicians or by charismatic leaders. One of the things that drives me crazy are people who cite trends over time without deciding where they're going to start the time period. For example, as I said, all sorts of wonderful things happened in the 1960s and beyond, and especially for the minorities and the poor and so forth. So what I did, I said, no, well, if you start the data in 1960, we don't know how much was a result of that and how much was a result of other things. But that also applies in other things. So for example, one simple one, many people say, Ralph Nader wrote this book in 1965, and about the automobile safety and so on. As a result, there were laws by the government, and the death rates went down after that, which is true in itself. But the death rate went down at a far higher rate prior to his writing the book. And this was the continuation of a trend that went back another 20 or 30 years.
Because car manufacturers, when it came right down to it, had very little interest in getting people killed.
Yes, you kill off your customers, your chances are you won't sell as many cars.
Right. The big fallacy, at least I take this as in many ways the heart of the book, racial fallacies. Now, in this section, in this chapter on racial fallacies, you begin, almost all of this book is addressed to the current moment. But in racial fallacies, you start by going back about 100 years.
Yes.
To lay out the progressive position in the 1910s and 20s, and for some years afterward. I'm quoting you. In addressing the massive increase in immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, this massive increase in immigration begins toward the end of the 19th century and carries on through the 1920s. In addressing the massive increase in immigration, progressives claimed that these new immigrants were inherently, genetically, and therefore permanently inferior. So your argument is that a century or so ago, progressives believed roughly the same about Polish and Italian immigrants that whites in the South had long believed about blacks.
Oh, yes.
All right. Social justice fallacies. I'm going to read a quotation, then I'd like you to take us through this material. With the passing years, more and more evidence undermined the conclusion of the genetic determinists. Jews who had scored low on the 1917 Army mental test began to score above the national average on various tests as they became a more English-speaking group. a study showed that black orphans raised by white families had significantly higher average IQs than other black children, close quote. So in the century since this, you call them genetic determinists,
Yes.
which is one way of putting it. They were racist.
Yes.
They believed that some races were permanently inferior.
Yes, and should be eliminated.
And we've learned that's total nonsense. But even more than that, we've learned that IQ is malleable. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by malleable.
Well, that is to say that this ranking of
the ranking changes
Jews
radically.
are stupid in 1917 because they score badly on tests, but they start
Yeah,
to
on
do better.
tests written in English.
Tests written in English. Okay.
And people who spoke English did better on those tests.
Or that blacks have a certain fixed IQ ranking, and then you have black orphans raised by white families. In other words, a different cultural.
But even before that study wasn't done until 1976.
Oh, that's a late
But even
one.
as of the time of World War One, the data show that black soldiers scored below white soldiers. And this is one of the reasons it's so that you need people with contrary opinions to be able to be free to attack things. The people who believe that this was genetically determined, they said, that's it, that's the answer, and they moved on. Some other people said, let's look at it more closely. And they discovered that black soldiers from New York, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and one or two other states scored higher than white soldiers from Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned in the book, people's genes do not change when they cross a state line. The problem is when you have people who are crusading for some idea, whatever the idea is, and they find some data that fits what they believe, that's the end of the story as far as they're concerned, which is fine if there are other people with contrary ideas who will look closer for something that goes the other way.
And then get listened to.
Yes, yes.
Racial assertions have ranged from the genetic determinism that we just discussed, which proclaimed that race is everything as an explanation of group differences, to the opposite view that racism is the primary explanation of group differences.
Yes.
How did this happen?
Oh, it happened because a lot of people arrived at the same conclusion, and they had high IQs and PhDs, and that was the end of the story as far as many people were concerned.
All right.
I mean, a high IQ and low information is a very dangerous combination.
As I read this book, for the most part, it's objective. It's objective throughout. It's calm. It's analytical. But when you take on this modern progressive position that racism accounts for anything, there are passages in which you're angry. I felt that there are passages in which there's emotion that is very close to this. So let me just read a little bit to you.
Okay.
Median black family income has been lower than median white family income for generations. But the median per capita income of Asian groups is more than $15,000 a year higher than the median per capita income of white Americans. Is this the white supremacy we're so often warned about? For more than a quarter of a century, in no year has the annual poverty rate of black married couple families, been as high as 10%. And in no year has the poverty rate of Americans as a whole been as low as 10%. If black poverty is caused by systemic racism, do racists make an exception for blacks who are married? Do you have the feeling when you're addressing this notion that racism accounts for everything, do you have the feeling that that the arguments are subtle, it's persuasive, you can forgive someone for buying that argument? Or do you have the feeling that it's willful, that the case is so clearly mistaken that there's a willfulness about it?
No, I don't. I think that people don't look for certain evidence, and therefore they don't find it. And so, on the basis of what they know at a given time, this may be very plausible. The problem is that what you really need are other people with different orientation who are skeptical and who will then look for things and find things that are very different from that.